Thank you, Igor. Thank you to the organisers. Thank you, Sylvia, for your wonderful talks and engaging conversations this morning. And I'd like to thank all the participants here. I've got to meet a lot of you already, and look forward to meeting the rest of you. And have, on the one hand, been really excited by the level of commitment and intellectual engagement, but that also raises a kind of nervousness and horror of the fact that I will offend so many of you with what I'm going to say. But I want to throw some things out there, and we can talk about them in the break and over the next couple of days. I've been asked to speak with you this evening on this question of the state and future of Marxist theory and political practice. In the most general terms, my argument will be that the stakes of the contemporary political economy are much higher than are generally anticipated, and that the stakes of the political economy are today ontological. Moreover, these ontological stakes are again higher not only in political terms but in economic and in theoretical terms. Left politics today must intervene not only simply by reclaiming but in transforming the nature of what is taken to be reality in the realms of the economy, politics and thought. In this then, I want to give tribute in what I say both to Silvia Federici, to whom I'll be referring throughout, and also to the work of Katerina Kolosova, and therefore to try and read the two side by side. I'll agree with Sylvia on pretty much everything. Indeed, what I say about her work will by this stage of the day probably be quite clear. At the same time, I'd like to repeat a point made earlier in the day by Katerina regarding the hijacking of concepts. We are today, as she insisted, called upon to initiate a set of new struggles in the theoretical field. To advance this is not to reduce everything to theory or to prioritise academic practice over others, but rather to stress the equal importance of that academic terrain. If there's something theoretical and economic in what I'm saying, I might also situate something of what I'm doing here regarding work in terms of my own specific political engagements in New Zealand, of which I might mention, for example, the work I've been trying to do for the New Zealand Labour Party, which has tried to reconstruct itself through elaborating a Future of Work Commission, a 2-year project building towards the election next year, in which I was asked to contribute with a group of other scholars thinking through the future of work. And in that direct and immediate experience with the Labour Party, one of the constant frustrations was the reproduction within the Labour Party of exactly the concept of work maintained by our enemies. What I'm wanting to advance then is that we on the left don't play with the same concepts as the right. Rather, we have different concepts of the basic constituents of social, economic and political reality. Regarding this intellectual struggle, we're faced today with many enemies, and I've spoken to a number of people who face these in just the economic demands of the next grant and so forth. But we also face some very subtle intellectual enemies. In intellectual terms, we're faced on the one hand with a resurgent positivism, a base descriptivism that reduces the world to only what appears. This dominates university discourse and rejects as metaphysical any consideration of the nature of things. On the other hand, a generalised postmodernism or post-structuralism similarly rejects as metaphysical any intervention regarding the nature of anything, and instead reflects a helpless insistence on plurality, multiplicity, or the reduction of any and all dominance to nothing more than a power that must be always resisted, even while the reasons for which one might resist usually reflect today little more than individualised radicalism or the assertion of an experimentation with self. This conjunction then of these intellectual tendencies in our current politics might go some way towards demonstrating why there is an immense political importance, as Kolosova and others have shown, in the end of metaphysics. In philosophical terms, the anti-metaphysical strand was masterfully and cunningly defended by Locke and then Kant. In the early 20th century by Wittgenstein, radiates through contemporary so-called post-metaphysical philosophy and in the garden varieties of positivism and postmodernism to which I've already gestured. But this Lockean and Kantian rejection of metaphysics in the name of finitude was already decisively interrupted by Hegel, and has again in recent years been given some room to breathe with the happy eclipse of postmodernism, and a set of reminders about the impossibility of avoiding formalism and universalism that we see with remarkable precision in, for example, the work of Alain Badiou. In this direction, then, I'm wanting to pay tribute to the remarkable work of Katerina Kolozova. In her magnificent book, Cut of the Real, she articulates a powerful riposte to the decision that she identifies in recent and contemporary post-structuralist and postmodernist thought to impose a radical limitation on thought. Against this, she makes an impassioned defence of and demonstration of the necessity of this breaking with limit, exposing the limits of limitation and of putting back to work the frame of the real, which is unafraid of the search for the universal. I'm not quite convinced that the monopoly of solutions to the problems that she identifies rests in the new speculative realisms, nor, for reasons of the history that I've just pointed to, the history of the contestation over metaphysics, that the entirety of philosophy is guilty of the charges that she quite properly identifies with recent post-structuralist thought. But I can, however, only commend her great book to you and join it in the breach that she and others are, which pushes beyond political liberalism and Kantianism in developing again a radical thinking of the real. The real, I will insist with Kolozova, is thinkable, although the real that will occupy me here today will rest within the realm of political economy. The talk is organised in 3 sections, regarding in turn the nature of work, the nature of resistance or refusal, and the nature of capital. First, I will summarise or recap on some of what Silvio Federici offers in a fundamental ontological reconceptualisation of work. Second, I turn to the place and priority of refusal of capital. And then third, I will argue that what Federici gives us to think about the nature of contemporary capital, and with that elaborate in particular the contemporary reality and importance of finance capital, both in relation to its high, its corporate and its everyday variety, its insinuation of risk management and investment into everyday life. If we'll be drawn with regard to financialisation to further elaborate certain elements which remain undeveloped in Federici's writing, well, at least to date, I will at the same time seek to show that her analyses of work and refusal are indispensable in thinking and intervening against finance capital. Firstly then, work. Left politics involves not simply redistributing or revaluing work, but rather involves a contestation of the nature of work as such. From the demands at the time of the French Revolution for the political inclusion of the third estate through to the demand for wages for housework, for or against housework, left politics expands what is counted as work within the present conception of work. It expands this to include types of activity previously not recognised as work. Accounting for exploitation not recognised as work, for value extorted by those who benefit from it as if it were a free gift of nature. This is a mechanism for contestation, an active act in class struggle. Such acts of ontological redefinition, I want to insist, are always crucial to left politics, and without these, a politics cannot meaningfully be called left. So for my own part, with regard to the Labour Party, I think that once we recognise that left politics involves a radical reconceptualisation of work and who is included as a worker, then that gives us some means to evaluate whether or not the Labour Party in my country bears any relationship to what we would call left. Federici proposes both a reclamation but also this ontological redefinition of work. In this, her account of work both radically elaborates and ultimately breaks from the limited conception of work that dominates in Marx and in most strands of Marxist theory. This is demonstrated in the account of primitive accumulation in Caliban and the Witch, just as much as in her demonstration of the New Deal as a politics of the command of reproduction. placing reproduction, and specifically the reproduction of labour power, at the heart of political and economic analysis is here a crucial manoeuvre. The wager in the early 1970s of wages for housework was to claim for housework the status of work as work. This foundational demand was captured then, as Federici put it in 1975, in the slogan, "Our work is work." Such an assertion is not the dumb identity of an A equals A, never is, but rather is the entry of something generally considered to be simply nature into the field of politics proper by its resignification as work. The logic of this claim in this campaign, one of which we should note was a remarkable success, was strictly continuous with the left politics of ontological redefinition. It involves a quite definite specificity with regard to the way that the work of reproduction is systematically devalued. Further, with great subtlety and in continuation with the Marxism that she had otherwise exceeded, Federici was able to explode the mystification of the relation to capital that appears in the form of the wage. I quote again from 1975, "The wage gives the impression of a fair deal. You work and you get paid, hence you and your boss each gets what's owed." And this, of course, is the fundamental mystification of the supply and demand of labour. In doing so, Federici, alongside Maria Rosa Della Costa, Selma James and others, was able to expose and to organise around the value of a work that is denied ontological status by capital, but that is pivotal to it. This devaluation, this lack of existence of reproductive work, was not only on the side of capital, but also on the side of those who had tasked themselves and had, at least temporarily, claimed responsibility for their opposition to capital, the unions and so forth. But this was not only a lack within the privileged unions of the West, but was equally a gaping hole in the analysis of work by Marx. Federici therefore posed the vital question: why did Marx so persistently ignore women's reproductive work? She toys with the explanation that reproductive work, and in particular the place of the housewife, did not develop until the end of the 19th century, so was unavailable to Marx. And also with the idea that he ignored it because he maintained a technologistic conception of revolution. Note that on one point Marx sees perfectly, but the world's not right. On the other, he's doing the opposite. Beyond these rather limited explanations she advances as to Marx's the limitations in Marx, she most pointedly argues that, I quote, "Marx failed to recognise the importance of reproductive work because he accepted the capitalist criteria of what constitutes work." End quote. This is vital, although it raises just as many questions as it resolves, and I don't think these are adequately resolved in Federici's work. It raises the very specific question of what exactly the capitalist criteria for work is. In this way, the idea of work in Marx reproduces the way that what capital recognises as work which is rewarded and paid as work. What is at stake here is what I've called in my writings on work, with a nod to Heidegger and Derrida, what I call the vulgar concept of work. In this, the vulgar concept of work is only seen in the most immediate presence of the activity of an individual. For Marx, recall, as he defines it in chapter 7 of volume 1 of Capital, labour is, I quote, "first of all a process between man and nature, a process by which man, through his own actions, mediates, regulates and controls the metabolism between himself and nature." In this conception of work, which is only for Marx what work is at first, but this remains through the dominant imaginary of how work is conceived in the Marxist tradition, there is a profound sense of the immediacy of work, so only what immediately appears as work counts as work. In doing so, Marx has extreme difficulty in seeing anything other than what it presents itself immediately as work. Here, of course, Marx, the great student of Hegel, should have seen, if we think that he had some faith to his great teacher, the mediations of the immediate, but was unable to think this through. A vital move in contesting the vulgar concept of work comes then in stressing the constitutive role of the work of others in the act of any supposed individual. In this, there are surprising resources which, as I've noted, Marx is unable to mine, in Hegel's effort to rethink the mediation of the subject by the other. Equally, there are resources for thinking beyond the immediacy of this vulgar concept of work. There are incredible resources for thinking this in the thinking of the other, which is dominated in French thought, from Lacan and Levinas through the feminist movements of the 1970s, which were then reclaimed, many of them, as the ground of post-structuralism. These intellectual developments, this prioritising of the action of the other in the subject, are as much, I would argue, the result of changes in the realm of production and as they are in reproduction, and also marked by the fears and hostilities provoked by capital of the recognition that work in production for the market or in home has its root and breeding ground in a long process in recognition of the prior presence in the action of the subject of the activities of others. The capitalist criteria of work, then, is not necessarily in the immediacy of work, but in the capacity for unrestrained exploitation. What is work for capital is that which capital recognises as work, and work in the fact that workers are able to demand a certain value for it. But in the same way that Marx identifies that for the capitalist the ideal length of the working day is 24 hours, the ideal level of wages for the capitalist is 0. Capital has no reason, unless it is forced, actively forced by us, to take on the cost of reproduction for itself, for the worker to be paid a cent more than they are willing to take. And that's why I want to stress, and here this will be crucial for the analysis of the market that I'll turn to in a minute, the rate of wages bears no immediate relation whatsoever to the value that is produced by that work, but only to the organised capacities for refusal of the worker. I turn then to resistance. Along with this fundamental ontological redefinition of work, which takes us outside of liberal politics, outside of economics and most sociology, and also out of doctrinaire Marxisms, in Federici there is also a radical reconceptualisation of resistance and refusal. And with this, the basic categories of power, initiative, and with this as well, the prospects for action. While a thinker such as Foucault could note in passing that one should not assume of refusal, rebellion and revolt that, I quote, we should not assume that they are only reaction or rebound, forming with respect to a basic domination, an underside that is in the end always passive, doomed to perpetual defeat, end quote. The analysis of power that is provided by Foucault and almost all of his followers is precisely of a power that always comes first and stands above a refusal or a resistance that only ever comes after. One of the key points of the demonstration of Caliban and the Witch is precisely the logical and temporal priority of the power of woman to the witch hunts. Witch hunts being a strategy of enclosure or primitive accumulation of reproductive work, and her demonstration of this in the historical development of capitalism. It's not that capital arrived on the scene first with clever strategies, like the kind of vision of the management consultant who's just arrived figuring out that he knows what they're going to do. But rather that the existing power of woman was one of the key obstacles that the rising capitalist class had to do away with. It might be interesting on this point to note that in my country, New Zealand, the accumulation of primitive accumulation by bloody means came after the peaceful introduction of capitalist production and trade. While capitalism was introduced effectively immediately upon the arrival of Captain Cook in my country in 1769, the development of capitalism first resulted in the amassing of economic and military power by the indigenous Māori, which far exceeded colonial powers. This then led, after the fact, to the land wars of the 1860s and the 1870s as a response to that power. I've noted the importance of the principle that work is valued as work. Work is only valued as work in relation to its refusal. The claim of wages for housework and all the varieties of that claim that have locally or generally been adopted. And note, these appear in childcare subsidies, paid parental leave and so forth. These have not entailed a celebration of work. Rather, the tactic is a celebration of our capacity refusal and a valuing of work only so that it can be refused. Federici then does not provide a sociology of domination that explains, either contentedly celebrating it or in sycophantic admiration of capitalist powers, which is what most critical sociology does. It does not explain the victimhood or passivity of the weak. It's always a demonstration of the powers of those taken to be powerless, or, as it's put in the language of Jacques Rancière, the capacities of those considered incapable. However, and again by contrast with Rancière, the analysis of Federici is not that of a merely symbolic or enticing instance of a temporary challenge to power, Jacques Atteux, etc. Rather, her analysis demonstrates in concrete material terms the capacities already existing in the present situation that can and are in the process of blowing that situation to pieces. And with that, as well, accounts for the fears of what is supposed to be the powers of the powerful. In this, there is then nothing abstract or utopian, while at the same time Federici never resigns herself to the inevitability of pure immanence. Also, and perhaps more importantly, Federici's insistence on our self-organising and the efforts of capital shows that these are a response to, that the efforts of capital are a response to our progressive struggles. As she explains, for example, capitalist globalisation, I quote, is a response to the cycle of struggles that, starting with the anti-colonial movement and continuing through the black power, blue-collar and feminist movements of the 60s and 70s, challenged the international and sexual division of labour, causing not only a historical profit crisis, but a true social and cultural revolution, end quote. It is against this assertion of the power of woman and others that it is this assertion of power of women and others that rattled capitalist hegemony at that moment. It was this power, and not the organised power of white male trade unions, that produced one of our greatest victories in the form of the capitalist crisis of productivity in the 1960s. The capitalist crisis of productivity is one of our victories. It is against this defeat that capital has, since the 1970s, been forced to respond, grasping madly at any and all weapons, old and new, that it can find. And as the witch hunts were a war on woman and on the power of woman, we have since the 1970s been dragged into a war of which it is difficult to yet gauge the depth of the consequences of capital to crisis. This crisis, however, Federici properly notes, has resulted in the opening since the 1970s of a nuclear war. The point that power from above forms its strategy and tactics not out of the purity of a scheming initiative, but in response to our power from below. This has been vital in many analyses of the present. In my own work and the work of several of my associates, such a position has been vital in understanding contemporary capital, and in particular contemporary finance capital. To take one example, my colleague Shanti Dallenbach has proposed to think of the waves of financial literacy education programs that have been unfurled following the events of 2011 as a strategy by finance capital of resistance from above. These programs of financial literacy education seek to recode the very real capacities of the desperately poor as financial illiteracy when they disobey the narrow remit of market participation. Financial literacy education in schools, communities and online wages a war against the waves of refusal induced by crisis and austerity, and specifically target those who are in command of reproductive expenditure. When this is understood, then, it should not be a surprise that the key determinant of financial illiteracy in most of the financial literacy discourse is gender. In my own work on finance, this reversal of perspective regarding the direction of resistance has been crucial in comprehending the development of finance since the 1970s. For those who assert or at least admit the social consequences of finance, this development of finance has often been portrayed as the discovery of a pernicious yet exceptionally clever new set of mechanisms for financial expropriation, a return of a cycle of financialisation that had been seen periodically in the long history of capitalism and that seeks to put accumulation back on its feet. By contrast, my effort, along with associates such as Dellenbach, Max Haven and the late Randy Martin, has been to understand finance as a resistance movement in its own right. Cast in these terms, finance is perhaps the most important and least well understood of the new social movements that flourished since the 1970s. This is not to say that finance is a progressive social movement, far from it. Still, positioning finance as a social movement, a regressive social movement, enables us to forestall some of the easy moralism of those interested in social movements and might call into question some of the analyses of social movements in those terms. More importantly, this reversal of the direction of power in the analysis of finance reminds us, even if finance today brings with it all of the particularisms and divisiveness of the history of capital, while inventing at the same time new novelties, this might remind us of our initiative and our collective power. I've therefore proposed that the analysis of the relation of finance to resistance must register finance as resistance, but then as a next step to this, must analyse in detail what it is that finance resists. I've noted as a first approximation following Federici that finance arises in resistance to the extra-parliamentary political movements of the 1960s and the crisis of profitability that this induced. Finance capital has also resisted those movements through international mobility, and I'll turn to international mobility shortly. But I'd like to point out another clue that has been particularly useful in my previous and current analysis of what finance resists, even if I'll have to gloss it very quickly here. Some of this analysis of finance and resistance appears in a paper which includes a diagnosis of the Prime Minister of my country, a former investment banker, foreign exchange trader for Merrill Lynch, who is now the Prime Minister of New Zealand, a John Key. And 2 or 3 weeks ago, a paper called John Key, the Bio-Financial Entrepreneur, was published. In this, in my teaching on finance, and in the book on finance that I'm working on at the moment, I've sought to understand this relation of finance to resistance through the key category of truth, in particular through analysing the relation of finance to truths as these arise in the domains of science, art and love, as well as in politics. I argue that alongside the better-known repudiations of truth that we've seen since the 1970s that are associated with postmodernism, democratic materialism, identity politics, or simply university discourse, finance today is perhaps the key opponent to truth. And further, finance is the ground from which we can understand these other cultural manifestations of opposition to truth. It is finance that enables us to think these other relations to truth. What finance resists in truth, and this is why it is so important, is on the one hand risk to capital. Finance is crucially risk management, or better, risk shifting. And on the other hand, what is feared by finance is the assertion of any ground that would connect the human being through a generic or universal ground. And it is these that finance resists, and these are also fertile grounds on which we can in turn resist finance capital. Do I have a couple of minutes to talk about finance more? We're going to talk about finance at all? Yep. Done? Go to the bar. Okay, the third thing I wanted to talk then is on to offer something of a basic conception of the nature of contemporary capital. And here I want to extend my relation to Federici, but also go somewhat beyond it. These brief remarks on the nature of work and the nature of resistance, which we can discuss further later if they're of interest, might enable me then to move to my third point, by which I might say a little more about the nature of contemporary capitalism, and more specifically, the nature of finance. Here again, I would like to stress the importance of Federici's account of both the development and the contemporary nature of capitalism, and in particular to draw out the importance of her recurrent insistence on forceful differentiation and the refusal and fear of collectivity that capital seeks to impose. In Caliban and the Witch, she stresses that the war on woman that characterised the witch hunt always also involved the elaboration of new antagonisms between men and women, and the contestation of earlier collective solidarities between men and women. Likewise, in her important critique of Hart and Negri, she notes that capital not only unifies by bringing together people in common in the workplace, and we should note, of course, that unification that capital produces is something that capital can never abide, but it also produces antagonism and separation in the realm of reproduction. To this, I might add and stress the importance that Federici has always placed on taking an international or planetary perspective on both economics and politics. Without a serious account of international and, at the same time, regional differentiation, it is quite impossible to understand much anything about the nature of contemporary capitalism in any location. In my own work, I've taken up this question of the relation between capital and difference in my outline of an ontology of finance that will appear in print in a paper called The World of Finance that should appear in a journal called Diacritics later this year. In this paper, I offer a formal sketch of the logic of difference in the practices of finance, and above all in capital asset pricing and arbitrage. While I don't have time to go through all of this in detail here, I might note that alongside the better-known dynamics of dematerialisation that comes with finance, so we know that finance kind of obliterates the world, there is also this crucially important, this activity of trade on pricing differentials. The allocation of profits according to a specific logic of the recognition of the unequal price of things that produce the same value for capital but are paid at a different price. This is a general dynamic of finance capital. But to bring this closer to my earlier comments on work, we can see this practice of differential pricing, finding the same thing which is valued differently in different places. We can find this with particular clarity in international labour arbitrage. International labour arbitrage involves finding elsewhere, or bringing from elsewhere, labour that will effectively be the same, but because of its different conditions or because it is on a different market, will be priced differently. To understand the dynamics of exploitation via international labour arbitrage requires us to reject some very specific ideas about the operation of capitalist markets. It requires specifically the categorical rejection of any idea of the coincidence of value and price, and more specifically involves rejecting the idea that work is ever paid at its value, a kind of idea that recurs in a lot of Marxist thought. Further, it involves rejecting the idea that the normal state of trade it takes place on one market, and rather lets us recognise that the normal state of trade is trade between more than one markets without stable or consistent prices. And this is how international labour arbitrage operates. Once we begin to grasp the fundamental ontological importance of difference for contemporary financialised exploitation of work, which takes place both in production and reproduction, a number of other dynamics become much clearer. We then can see, following the points made above about refusal, but now adding the element of difference, that capitalist globalisation was driven by the success of the anti-capitalist struggle in the global north. The outsourcing of care work, of reproductive work, of sex work and domestic help to the global south, whether or not workers remain in the global south or not doesn't matter, was the result of the successes of the feminist and other movements in the global north. We can also then see that those basic elements of logistical capitalism, such as containerisation, the shipping container, road transportation, shipping, logistics, these arise from the prospects for differential rates of exploitation of productive and reproductive labour that result from differential rates of refusal in different conditions in different parts of the world. In this search then for profit, what capital wants from us is work without end. Whether in factories, fields, offices or the home, capital demands of us that we work for capital. And when capital manifests itself in the form of a person, that the guardians of capital insist that we work for them. Ideally with no payment at all, but if necessary, and if the conditions are right, at the minimum of cost with the maximum return. In this sense, contemporary capitalism remains radically mercantilist, operating at buying cheap of labour while selling dear the results of labour. This certainly does not cause a generalised immiseration of the worker. And in this sense, Marx was quite wrong to assert that the general law of capitalist accumulation is that capital, I quote, makes an accumulation of misery a necessary condition corresponding to the accumulation of wealth, end quote. It's from chapter 25 of volume 1. Better, there is an accumulation of misery, but this is a differential accumulation of misery. In this, Marx was far from attentive enough to the logic of difference, something which we, ironically perhaps, after 50 years of French philosophy, might be able to return to the scene of thinking difference, not to celebrate difference, but to reclaim difference and perpetual differentiation as the logic of capital in its high mercantile phase, or if we were to call it its name in the age of finance, capital. I think I'll end there and we can take any questions for discussion.
Okay.